That sound okay? Very good. Let's get underway. Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Father Richard Finn, for those of you who don't know me, and it's my pleasure as Director of the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice to welcome you to this event. Whether you are here physically present at Blackfriars in Oxford, or whether you're joining us online. In a moment, I shall introduce our distinguished speaker, Fergal Keane, who has, as you can see, been forced by a sudden change of circumstances to deliver tonight's lecture across the internet from somewhere, I believe, in the Middle East. But we're extremely grateful to Fergal for his commitment to speaking tonight, despite this development and his sudden posting overseas again. But first, I should say a few words about the Institute and its inspiration, Bartolomé de las Casas. Bartolomé de las Casas was a plantation owner in the Caribbean whose conversion experience in the early 16th century led him to become a Dominican friar, but through that vocation led him to champion, through many writings, the human rights of indigenous peoples in the Americas. The institute that he inspires is a research centre based here at Blackfriars Hall in the University of Oxford that seeks to look at difficult questions of social justice through the lens of Catholic social thought and practice. Among current research projects is work on the humanitarian response, the ethical humanitarian response to climate emergency, radical rethinking of economics, led by Professor Peter Rona, who's here tonight, and also a research project on the leadership roles played by religious women during the Northern Ireland Troubles, while work is also starting on the role of local communities and parishes in promoting better health. Well, it's my especial honour to welcome and introduce our distinguished speaker this evening, Fergal. Fergal Keane was born in England, but brought up in Ireland, and began his career in journalism with the Limerick Leader, I believe, and then with RTE. He joined the BBC in 1989 as a Northern Ireland correspondent, then became a Southern African reporter, Asia correspondent in 1994, and from 1996, a key member of the corporation's World Affairs unit. Fergal is the recipient of numerous prestigious awards for his reporting, especially with respect to the 1994 Rwanda genocide. That year, he won both the Royal Television Society Journalist of the Year Award and was named the Sony Radio Reporter of the Year, while his documentary on Rwanda, Valentina's Story, was recognized by a BAFTA award. Among many other awards since then, he has won the James Cameron Prize for War Reporting, the Edward R. Murrow Award for Foreign Reporting, the Index on Censorship Prize for Journalistic Integrity, and the 1995 Orwell Prize for his book Season of Blood. He was named OBE in 1997. And much more recently, Fergal's 2022 documentary on war crimes in Ukraine, made in collaboration with Alice Doyard, I Call Him by His Name, was itself named Feature Story of the Year from the Foreign Press Association. And although perhaps best known for his war reporting, Fergal has also produced important documentaries on Forgotten Britain and its follow-up, Brave Britain with Fergal Keane, and a series of programmes on the history of Ireland. Now, by his own admission, all this work has also cost Fergal much. He has written and spoken candidly, for example, about his own experience of PTSD. His commitment to the truth, however harrowing, a commitment to its investigation and dissemination, his concern for the realities of human suffering, his care for the value of human life. All this aligns him closely with the spirit of Bartolomé de las Casas. Who more fitting then to give the annual Las Casas lecture on the world we choose to see, reflecting love and hope in an age of conflict. Fergal, you're very welcome. Over to you.
Thank you very, very much. My apologies for not being there in Oxford with you in person tonight. Too often, it's been the nature of my work that I am called away, and commitments that I have made have fallen by the wayside. I am glad, however. One of the few things that I like about modern technology is the fact that I can still keep a promise, even if it is virtually. It reminds me, the last time something of this order happened, in many ways it was a lot less serious, because I had managed to get tickets to see Ireland playing England at Twickenham. And so I was all set up to head off there with my son Daniel and watch the game. And of course, that was the weekend when the politicians of Northern Ireland, after 20 years of dithering, decided that they would finally have a sensible peace agreement. And so I had to give up my tickets for the cause of peace in Northern Ireland and head over to Belfast. Anyway, and there have been many other such occasions, but it's really wonderful to be here with you tonight. And that word, Richard, that you just used, that phrase, the value of a single human life, that is it for me. That is what drives my reporting. The knowledge that, however humble, however poor, however marginalized the person who dies as a result of violence, that life is just as important as the most exalted. And it's a thing we forget, a thing that has been forgotten. It is, our world is structurally created now to create very different values on human life. It is something I see in my travels around the world all of the time. I should say something before I go on about a friend of mine who has died and who reflected the values of tolerance, of interdependence, who truly knew the value of a single human life. And that was Michael Longley. He has just died, the great Irish poet, at the age of 85. He was a winner of so many prizes and a voice of sanity throughout our brutal war of identity on the island of Ireland. Wherever I travel, I carry a volume of Michael's work. I've done that for years. Here in Amman and in Jerusalem in the last few days, I've spent another week looking at images of bodies being dug from under the ruins of Gaza. It's been a week of traumatized, hungry children scrambling for food, grieving parents, searching hospitals for the dead, hostage families whose loved ones haven't been returned home from Gaza, and a great many despairing conversations with friends, Israeli and Palestinian. And I have turned to Michael's work as so often before. Now, back in 1994, on the occasion of a tentative IRA ceasefire, he wrote a poem called Ceasefire, and it evoked the pain of compromise in societies that are brutalized by conflict. It asked, what is it that is asked of those who have seen their loved ones killed? And Michael harked back to Homer's Iliad and the image of King Priam of Troy going to Achilles to plead for the return of the body of his son Hector, whom Achilles has slain in battle. And Michael put himself into King Priam's mind and wrote, I go down on my knees and do what must be done and kiss Achilles' hand, the killer of my son. And Achilles, the fierce, who had humbled so many, agreed to a truce to allow Priam bury his son. There's a powerful message that I don't need to labor here. in those words about the necessity of humility and courage in creating peace. I was, I think, driven to do the work that I do by the facts of my upbringing. And it had many fractures and many dysfunctions, but I was never, ever in any doubt about the social consciences of my parents. My father, Eamon, an actor, my mother, Maura, a teacher. They were people well ahead of their time. And at a time in Ireland when the official role of the church was so burdensome on many of us, when the country felt so claustrophobic, both of them were a real breath of fresh air in terms of what they believed. They weren't anti-clerical people, but they were apostles for justice, and would confront hypocrisy where they found it. And I think particularly in the case of my mother, who taught in a religious school and was confronted, frequently with the problems of young women, young girls in school, that in a previous Ireland, and to some extent in that Ireland still in the 1960s and the 1970s, they would have found themselves shunted out of sight, packed off to mother and baby homes. But my mother was one of those people who had time to listen to those who were frightened, who were marginalized, who were on the outside. And I am so grateful for their example, and also to the teachers I had. And I had a religious education with the Presentation Brothers. My story of the Irish religious education is very different to that of many others. I was fortunate to have as a headmaster a man called Brother Jerome Kelly, who had been a priest, who had been a religious brother in the Caribbean at the time of independence, of decolonization, and to then come back from there to take over Presentation College Cork, which at the time was wittily and I'm afraid very accurately described as the place where the cream of Cork went, the rich and the thick. And it was a place it was a place for the sons of the merchant princes. And I wasn't the son of a merchant prince, but my uncles had gone there, my granduncles had gone there, so that it was only natural that I went. But Jerome Kelly, arrived in this place full of ideas about changing us, changing how we saw the world, so that it would no longer be boys who went to school, went to rugby matches at the weekend, left school, went to university, did a BCom, and then went on to get safe jobs on the South Mall in insurance companies or banks. And the better the rugby player you were, the better the job you would get in that sphere in Cork. Jerome Kelly came in and shook our world. The first thing he did was to set up a group called Share, which was a bit of a sort of wordy title, Schoolboys Harness Aid for the Relief of the Elderly. But what he did was, besides having this yearly fast in Cork, where we went out and collected many thousands of pounds to build housing for the elderly poor of Cork, he asked us to go and visit people on weeknights and at weekends, elderly people living in slum conditions in Cork. And what an eye-opener that was for us. These protected, in many cases, I would say we were spoiled children. We were children of privilege, there's no doubt about that. And to walk into these mouldy, damp flats, slums in which elderly people were spending their last days, it woke me up profoundly. He also set up a television station and a radio station in Pres. We only broadcast to each other, but we were for the first time standing in front of cameras, standing in front of microphones, and learning about media studies, and encouraged us to be debaters and to challenge the status quo, to challenge accepted opinion. And once he figured out what your views were on a subject, he would always insist you argued the opposite. And I'm really profoundly grateful. So that was the I think the world that shaped me, it gave me an armor, I think, when it came to confronting those who would oppress and those who believed in violence as a means of achieving their aims, whether that was state terror or terrorism. It was a kind of, how should I put it? It was an education in fair-mindedness, in reason, in rationality. Now, the world that I have operated in and still operate in, is nothing like that. I've been a journalist now for over 40 years. Most of that time has been spent in zones of conflict. From Northern Ireland, where I did my first conflict reporting, to now here in the Middle East, where I am watching the dreadful playing out of the crisis in Israel-Palestine. I have witnessed famine, civil war, ethnic cleansing, genocide. And yet I remain a hopeful person. I am, to borrow the words of Desmond Tutu, addicted to hope. He used those words about South Africa. And I want to talk about the necessity of hope. I will talk about some of the places that I've been and bring you to meet the individuals from whom I draw inspiration, the people who've helped me keep alive hope without ever forgetting the immense ongoing cost of our cruelty to each other. And in that regard, I'd like to quote some favourite lines of poetry from John Hewitt, another Ulster poet like Michael Longley, who wrote in the terrible year of 1972 as deaths were mounting in Northern Ireland. Patriotism has to do with keeping the country in good heart, the community ordered with justice and mercy. These will enlist loyalty and courage often, and sacrifice, sometimes even martyrdom. Bear these eventualities in mind also. They will concern you forever, but at this moment, bear in mind these dead. Northern Ireland, as I've said, was my first experience of conflict and also what it takes to bring conflict to an end. When I went there in the middle of the 1980s to live in Belfast, it's just a relentless dialogue of the deaf between the political parties. My daily working life revolved around traveling to the scenes of assassination, of bombing, of funerals, interviewing the families of those who had been killed. But when I look back on that, and it very much ties into Michael Longley's famous idea of civilization being something that revolves around community and the courage of people who are willing to help each other and to try and create a wall against sectarianism and bonds between each other. And so when I look back, I realized there was a great deal that I missed while I was covering the violence. And that was, for one thing, to recognize that the vast majority of people had decided to stay in Northern Ireland because they knew the meaning of home and they worked to preserve that. And I think if you had watched a great deal of the reporting of Northern Ireland over the 30 years of the Troubles, certainly in the national media and particularly the international media who zipped in and out only at times of trouble, you would have had the impression that this was a society where people were perpetually at each other's throats, that there could be no bridging between the interests of and the feelings of Protestant and Catholic. And yet, in my own daily experience, I was shown that that was not true. Northern Ireland was full of cross-community groups who did everything from running meals on wheels to elderly people across sectarian peace lines, to groups like Amnesty International, Oxfam, all of whom had vibrant local branches, the British Red Cross, but also countless others whose specific focus was on bringing people from different traditions together. Sometimes I would sneer, you would have sort of rowing for peace, clog dancing for peace. Um, but when I look back at that, I think how valuable and how brave, how essential that was. And people like me who were, even though I'd lived there, people who were surprised by the peace agreement. I don't think we should have been. I don't think we should have been. Because had Northern Ireland been like, this place where both communities were at each other's throats, you would have had Bosnia. And no amount of British troops or policemen would have been able to prevent that from happening. There was a conscious choice made by the majority of people to live decent, civilized lives. A conscious choice not to hate their neighbours. And so when peace came, I think it was certainly, of course, due to the bravery of politicians who were willing to sit down in the same room with each other, of paramilitary leaders who were willing to give up violence, of leaders like Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern and Bill Clinton, who invested the time that no previous political leadership had ever invested in Northern Ireland. All of these things were critical. But for me, the most important factor was the people of Northern Ireland, who understood better than any the value of a single human life, because they had seen 3,500 of them taken during the course of that conflict. Now, I went to South Africa from Northern Ireland, and I do remember getting on the plane at Belfast and feeling this great sense of relief, because I was going from a place where I could not see any possibility of political change to one where, yes, there was a great deal of extreme violence taking place, but where there was a really deep sense of hope. Mandela had been released from prison the previous year. The ANC had been unbanned. Negotiations were, yes, they were on, they were off, they were on, but there was a sense of momentum moving towards something. And I was privileged to be there, and my friends Tim and Mariana in the audience tonight know well, because they too witnessed the extraordinary transition from apartheid to democracy. And watching that and remembering some of the people I knew, and I'm thinking particularly those at grassroots level in the townships, and the real democracy that I witnessed at different township meetings where everybody had to have their say. I mean, the most repeated phrase in South Africa that I can remember is not Nkosi Sikeleli Africa, but it is Chairman, point of order. and that spoke to a people who had their fill of being told what to believe, where to go, to having their lives utterly controlled by a white autocracy. They were determined to have their say, and they had it. And I've always thought that the great strength of South Africa, and please, I am not naive. I still spent quite a bit of time in the country. I'm not naive about the huge challenges at the moment and the failures that there have been under democratic rule. But I've always thought the country's great strength was its fractiousness. And that's one of the things that gives me hope. People who are willing to argue. And you see this reflected in a vibrant free press and civil society. Relentless challenging. We know about the corruption because there are activists and journalists who are brave enough to tell us and who won't give up in spite of considerable intimidation by some of those who have been involved in the corruption. And I think that's it is an example. I've being here in the Middle East and witnessing what is going on, I can feel myself longing to get on a plane to Joburg and just breathe in some of that old hopeful atmosphere. And as I say, I'm not naive. I've done investigations into corruption in South Africa, documentaries on it, and doubtless I'll do more. But I think I'm thinking of that great phrase of Nadine Gordimer's, which she used when she talked about the essential gesture. And she used it during the age of apartheid and referred to people who confronted the evil of that system in however small their way. It might have been simply as a member of the Black Sash standing on a roadside with a placard, or it could have been Stephen Biko being beaten to death by security policemen. Each individual's challenge, their courage, of course, is different. What they're willing to lose is different. But the essential gesture of saying, of knowing that this is wrong and being willing to make the gesture, that is so important, and it will become increasingly important to us. And I saw that in Rwanda. Now, you might ask me, why would I bring Rwanda into a talk that is about hope? And I'll tell you why. I went there from South Africa. Mandela had just been sworn in as president, and I was asked to go and report on an unfolding series of massacres. I don't think we were calling it genocide at that point. And so in May, I went with my colleagues in, and I will, to this day, never forget the extraordinary emptiness of that landscape as we drove in, and then becoming aware of the smell of death drifting through the windows. And it was there really throughout the journey. You never got away from it. And to recap the facts, you had 800,000 plus people murdered in the space of 100 days, an extraordinary rate of slaughter, and much of that carried out by people against their neighbors, and not done with bombs from the air, where there is this kind of detachment, where you never see or smell the consequences of your actions. But here, people took clubs, machetes, and beat and hacked their neighbors to pieces. And traveling around Rwanda, we saw the results of that in mounds of bodies piled in churchyards, bodies floating in rivers, and survivors, tiny groups of survivors slowly emerging as the rebel army, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, defeated the genocidal regime. And in the course of that experience, I encountered a young woman called Valentina. It was at the parish church of Nyarabuye, near the border with Tanzania in the west. And when I first came across her, Valentina was, 12 years old. And she was lying in a filthy room on filthy bed sheets with other wounded children, with a machete blow which had sliced her head open, her fingers chopped off and already black and poisoned, and a couple of women trying to help, but with no medicine. And we gave them our paracetamol. It was all we had. And I went away and I thought, well, in fact, I wrote in the script of the documentary we made, I didn't believe she was going to survive. And then several years later, I went back to Rwanda. And I was in the area, and I asked after Valentina about what had happened to her. And I was told she'd survived. And we went to see her. And Valentina was now living with an aunt. All of her parents had been killed. She had hidden under their bodies in order to survive. And now she was living with an aunt, but clearly deeply traumatized. And it was her right hand that had been hacked. So she was having to relearn how to write. And trauma was clearly getting in the way of her being able to absorb knowledge, to retain knowledge. And I met her, and it was really wonderful to see that she'd survived, but the scale of trauma was really quite extreme. And she spoke of nightmares all of the time, of dreaming of lying under the dead, of the dogs attacking the bodies of her parents. And we went away, we broadcast the film, and people in Britain responded with extraordinary generosity. Her story touched them, the value of that single human life. And with the funds that people gave, we passed them on to family members in Rwanda. And Valentina went to another school where she was able to be given more individual educational attention. And then time moved on, and I started getting messages from Valentina. And I then heard that she was being invited to come to Britain for Holocaust Memorial Day to commemorate genocide and to speak about the Rwandan genocide. And I remember the morning that was happening, I was naturally, of course, late, doing too many things and stuck in traffic. And I was one of the last people to get there. And I came in the back of the hall. It was down in Chelsea, if I remember rightly. And up the back steps to the stairs. And I came in, and Valentina, who was by now this tall, graceful young woman, turned around, looked at me, and smiled, this wonderful, broad smile. And it was, my God, if that couldn't make me feel hope, nothing on earth could. And she's now living in America with kids of her own, teenage kids of her own. She's working. She's making a future for her and for them. I mean, that's one story, but, all success in the story of humanity is built out of many individual stories. And there are several other people in Rwanda with whom I had the same experience, and in other war zones. Sometimes people say to me, "Oh, well, you're always there at the misery, Keane." Yes, I am. But look at what I do, look at what I write, and you will always find my hunger for hope. Because if I didn't believe there was decency in us, the capacity for decency, I think we'd have vanished a long time ago. Now, you might look right now at the world picture and think, as I do, that it is a time to feel foreboding. Yes, autocracy is on the rise, authoritarianism on the rise. Worse, we are seeing the normalization of cruelty, of selfishness, on a scale that hasn't been seen since the 1930s. And I'm very wary of parallels with what Auden called that low, dishonest decade. I think each period in history is quite singular, but there are also commonalities, particularly the power of the lie, the dissemination of the lie through new media. X. And the frustration one feels as somebody who does his best, not always successfully, but I do my best, and I know many friends and colleagues who do, to convey the facts, and realizing how inadequate that is, set against the tidal wave of prejudice, of lies, of people believing what they want to believe because it's more comfortable. It's a danger that I have watched grow and grow with every coming year. This populist rhetoric, this pandering to people's fear. And it strikes me the absolute task of our age is to define what our values are. Stop worrying for a second, about our fears, about our resentments, and ask what it is that we value, what it is that we're willing to fight for. And I'm thinking of the courage of people I've seen. Another thing that gives me hope. in civil society groups. I spoke about South Africa, but I'm also thinking of places where it isn't so safe to campaign against oppression. For example, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and where I came across this group of lawyers who sit down and patiently write out people's rights under the law, their rights to protection from exaction by the military or by militia forces. And then they photocopy these and cycle from village to village, handing them out. Or I think of the wonderfully named the Protestant Women's Club of Kechenga in near Goma in the Democratic Republic of Congo, who spend their time caring for younger women, very often teenage girls, children, who have been raped by the military and by the militia, and who face constant intimidation, but who don't give up. These people are everywhere. Again, Odin, these points of light, where the civilized speak to each other. How do you do that in your own life? How do you, the question I'm asked by people so often these days when they're looking at what's going on, is it's terrible, I'm despairing, what do I do? Look, I don't have a good answer, because I think the answer is, it's very individual. Right now, it's actually easy for us to stand up and do things that bind our communities, that reject intolerance. There may come a time, we're seeing it already in America, when it is not so easy to stand up and be counted and to speak out. There may come a time when that will take friends away from you, family away from you, from me, where it may take your liberty away. I don't want to sound alarmist, but I think if the last few years have taught us anything, it is that there is no time now for complacency. The potential for radical change for the worse is unlike anything I have ever seen. So I appeal to your, and all of you, in a sense, part of the problem is the kind of people who listen to me tonight, who are already engaged in the work of social justice, in confronting intolerance and prejudice. So, I think you're on my side. But I think the thing that I'm trying to do myself is to meet with those who don't share those values and to try and evangelize for them, and not in a way that immediately drives them away, feeling that I am approaching them as a superior being. Trying to listen to them. I think that's one of the great mistakes that the Democratic Party made in the course of the last several American elections. You get nothing, and any good negotiator will tell you this, particularly those who work in peace and reconciliation. You get nothing by telling them how awful they are. It is a task of individual engagement. So my faith, my hope, as is evident from everything I've said tonight, lies in the power of individual action, back to Nadine Gordimer's essential gesture. Now, at the outset, I quoted my dear late friend, Michael Longley, and his poem Ceasefire. And I'm going to finish, before we open up to a discussion, with another of his poems. And this was written about a murder that I reported on in Northern Ireland. It was an off-duty, a reserve policeman who was minding his brother's ice cream shop on the Lisburn Road in Belfast when the IRA shot him dead. And Michael wrote this poem. Michael also lived nearby and wrote this poem about it. And I urge you to listen very closely to his words, because I think he has said in, 12 lines, everything I've been trying to say tonight. Who was it who suggested that the opposite of war is not so much peace as civilization? He knew our assassinated Catholic greengrocer who died at Christmas in the arms of our Methodist minister, and our ice cream man whose continuing requiem is the 21 flavors children have by heart. Our cobbler mends shoes for everyone. Our butcher blends into his best sausages leeks, garlic, honey. Our corner shop sells everything from bread to kindling. Who can bring peace to people who are not civilized? All of these people, alive or dead, are civilized. Thank you.
Fergal, thank you so much. It is an extraordinary achievement to be able to do what you have done for us this evening in holding together the terrible situation in which we live, what we see unfolding in the world around us, but have done so in a way that actually gives us hope and communicates a sense of those values essential for peacemaking. If we can open up now the floor for discussion, I'm going to ask first if there are people in the room who have questions they'd like to put to Fergal or comment they'd like to make. And then we'll go online and ask those who are with us on the internet if they have questions they'd like to put. Who would like to go first? Scott, would you like to stand up and come forward perhaps to make sure that Fergal can hear?
I think not just questions, but if people have comments.
Oh, comments as well, yes.
Hi, Fergal. Scott Thomas. I have a research fellow here, research associate here. And I want to go back to what you've written wonderfully about Nelson Mandela, whether this seems to fit very much, which it seems to me that what the genius of Mandela, what he realized in prison and before, was that apartheid not only dehumanized blacks, it dehumanized whites together. And that the only way forward was that coming recognition of the mutual relationship of that to move forward. And I think about the righteous, so-called righteous victims that Benny Morris talks about, both the Palestinians and the Israelis coming to a recognition that what's happening is dehumanizing both sides as a way forward. Thank you.
Yes, I think one of the things that has fascinated me is, and it's not a popular field of study, and that is perpetrator trauma, which I've looked at in Rwanda and a couple of other places in the world. And unless you are a psychopath, and I should start by saying I have encountered in all of these years of war reporting, I think I could count the number of psychopaths I've met on the fingers of one hand. They're not the people that bother me. They're not the people who keep me awake at night. The people who do are people like us, who find themselves in situations where wrongdoing, cruelty, the oppression of others is permissive. So societies where this is encouraged, and whether that is out of fear, and very often fear is the driver, or whether it is out of, a long history of antagonism, so that perfectly normal people can do the most appalling things. And that is the issue, that the one that concerns me. Mandela, you referenced Mandela, and yes, there's been quite a bit of revisionism going on in certain sections in South Africa on the left, and to some extent in the rest of the world, saying, well, he sold out to the whites. And look, I can just tell you from my personal experience of living there at the time, and of having been in South Africa during apartheid days, that just wasn't how it was at the time. The extreme violence that we witnessed in the period 1990 to 94, hugely fomented by the apartheid state, but also playing into existing tensions and power struggles in Black politics. And of course, rooted in centuries of poverty and discrimination that could very easily have developed into a full-scale civil war. I'd no doubt about it, as somebody who was there witnessing what was going on. And the idea that a peaceful settlement and a non-racial democracy was a given, I didn't think so until the day of voting. I really didn't. I certainly hoped. I thought there were a lot of good things going for it, but it was certainly not a given. And I do remember, if I have to pick one moment of extraordinary moral leadership, it was when the ANC's military leader and one of the leading figures of the Communist Party, Chris Hani, was assassinated by a right-wing gunman. And I got the news. I was walking my dogs in Joburg, and I got the news on a pager, and I just thought to myself, whoa, this is where it could really go over the edge. And many people felt that across the different communities, because I was talking to them, friends were ringing me. And later that day, I remember sitting in my car and switching on the radio, and Mandela came on. And he was across all radio stations. And he appealed to people not to take to the streets and be violent. And he said, keep your eyes on the bigger picture, on the prize. And it worked. Now, I've seen a lot of leaders who've done the opposite, who would have taken a moment like that, as happened in Rwanda, to send the killers into the streets, to say, take revenge. There's only one thing they understand. Mandela didn't do that. And yes, there were, those of us who were there remember how cranky he could get and how impassioned he could get, particularly on the subject of state involvement in violence. And one has to say he's been proven correct in much of the subsequent investigations. But at that moment, when it really counted, Mandela took the path of statesmanship. And if for nothing else, he should be remembered for that. Leadership is about, this is an era, don't forget, where we had the Milosevic's, the Mladić's, the Karadzic, the 90s, with the Habyarimana's and their ilk in Rwanda. It was not a nice time. It was Primo Levi's great phrase, monsters with beautiful words. Ethnic nationalism was on the rampage. And Mandela so went against the current of that time.
Any other comments? Patrick, I can also say, if you're online, do please put your questions into the Q&A or the chat, and we'll be able to see those and bring them forward. Patrick.
Well, thank you very much, Patrick Watt from Christian Aid. Lots of what you said resonates. I was talking with a group of journalists last week about how to go about generating more media attention on the crisis in Sudan. And we were talking about news avoidance amongst the public. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on the extent to which news avoidance is partly the result of stories of hope and agency not being told in the midst of stories of crisis, and whether over the course of your journalistic career, you have seen a change in editorial decisions about what gets given time and how much space there is to tell the stories of hope that you've described. Thank you.
I mean, I think it was ever thus. You know the old phrase, if it bleeds, it leads. And I haven't just worked in the BBC, I've worked in newspapers for other broadcasters. It's always been the way that we're driven towards the dramatic, the macabre very often. And it's a challenge. I mean, I've just, I've spent the last couple of weeks constantly viewing footage coming out of Gaza and doing stories. And yesterday I did a piece about families looking for the dead, and very often all they can find are some bones, and they try to identify their missing loved ones through the clothes they were wearing. A young guy yesterday called Mohammed found his brother through the sneakers that his brother was wearing and which he was immensely proud of owning. And how do you tell a story like that with hope? I mean, how do you tell any story out of that tragic place, out of Israel and Palestine, with hope? And my answer, I guess, to that is, and it ties into everything I was talking about in the talk proper, and that is to try and find the individuals who are refusing to give in to despair. And I'm principally thinking of people in Israeli and Palestinian civil society who confront the injustices that they see every single day. I'm thinking particularly of a story that I did about an Orthodox Jew who is a very religious man who goes into the northern Jordan Valley every day with a Palestinian friend of his who's a shepherd. Now, and he has been beaten up by settlers, intimidated by the army, all of the usual stuff. Now, you might say that's a bit like you're back in Northern Ireland, you're clog dancing for peace, etc. You know, it's all very worthy, but of course, you know, if you actually look at the number of people who are doing this, it really is quite extraordinary. The number of organizations, whether it's, you know, Breaking the Silence, B'Tselem, many Peace Now, many others, and documenting what is happening in Palestinian lives. That is something that gives me hope, and it's something I should be doing more work on. I've done a couple of stories on it, but I need to do more. On your specific case in terms of Sudan, I would say that there's such competition now for people's attention. And the crisis in Israel-Palestine has historically, you know, had a massive draw for audiences. Now, there are lots of different reasons for that. But the moment we would, for example, in the BBC, start paying less attention to that and more to Sudan, people would start screaming at us. And we also have a very strong domestic agenda at the moment. In a way, when you ask for more coverage for Sudan, you're preaching to the converted. I've spent a lot of time reporting Sudan. I wish there was more coverage of Sudan and other places. I mean, I think I look, for example, at what's happening in Myanmar. I look at the developments in the Asia-Pacific region, which are truly ominous in places, and realize that they're undercovered. There is only so much that gets done. How would you go about getting more on for Sudan? That's something I have to give thought to, because I've been so preoccupied with Israel-Palestine. There, I've just done something journalists very rarely do, and that's to say, I don't know. It's vital. I think it's absolutely vital to say that more and more, because we don't. I don't.
Perhaps if I could put a question to you, Fergal, what do you make of the changes within the media through which we can access the truth? The media seems to be changing quite a lot with the weakening of public broadcasting.
It is.
How easily can we actually get at the truth that you and others like you are investigating?
Well, there's a word for you, truth. Whose truth? There was a time when I used that word with ease, with naivety. I think I'm now much more aware of the kind of pressures that are brought to bear, the restrictions, the filtering that goes on. I think that it's paradoxical. On one level, international reporting has improved beyond measure. When I started out covering Africa, it was quite possible for a Western journalist to drop in write or broadcast whatever they liked, however cliche-ridden as it frequently was, uh, and uninformed, put it out on television or on the front page of a newspaper, create a certain image of Africa, a stereotype, and walk away and nobody would say anything. Now, if you do that, there's an army of people online who will call you out. And it's not just Africa, it's various different parts of the world. So there has been a genuine democratization. I'm just speaking for myself, I'm much more careful now about, being absolutely true, not simply to the bare facts, but to how people in the country themselves perceive the position that they're in. In other words, not imposing my impressions and my baggage. All of us, anybody in the audience who's on social media or who writes or broadcasts, knows well that it is not possible, as a colleague in the broadcasting industry once said, in a live two-way from South Africa, about a very elderly minister who'd just been appointed by Mandela. He's an absolute up-and-comer, one of the real young Turks of the ANC, as I say. The man was in his late 70s. Well beyond his best, which was never very good at any time. Now, if you did that now, you would be absolutely lacerated, and rightly so. So that's the good side of it. The downside is waking up, as I did this morning, to the kind of hate mail that I get, saying, how can you believe those animals? They brought all this on themselves. And that's some of the politer stuff, or the barrage of abuse on social media, which of course is very cynically calculated to frighten you or to make you so weary that you will think, oh, I'm just not going to go there. I'll avoid that kind of story. So if you ask me what my essential gesture is, it is to come off Twitter, ignore all that nonsense, and just keep telling the story.
Thank you. John Magnus, can I check with you some questions from our online community?
Do you have one? I just think
Do you want to come to the front and present it?
Up to the front of the class, please.
So Keith
Now,
says,
what were you saying?
a major source of hope must come through our children. What are your thoughts on how we can promote youth in the future to recognize serious bias, intolerance in others, and to promote a sense of fairness and equality, to encourage them to live lives in ways that promote tolerance, sense of care for welfare for people, and provide skills and the ability to influence those views to go against values of equality and care for others?
I think they're doing it. I'm hugely encouraged and moved by what I see in young people who aren't just taking to the streets to protest, important as that is, but who are engaging in organizations that are active on climate change, economic justice, human rights. My kids, I can just speak for my own and my partner's children, they're hugely impassioned and engaged and informed. I'm not sure they're the ones we have to worry about. I think it's, older generations, frankly, who are set in their ways, set in their opinions. It's how to preserve some of that hope and idealism that exists in the younger generation as we transition through, I hope transition through, this really dangerous period. So I give them a lot more credit, I think. I think they give me more hope than my own generation does, to be honest.
Yeah, we have no other online minutes.
Okay.
Yes, please.
I would like to have the hope that you have. I'm American and British, and I'm just reeling, obviously, from the election results, and watching the inauguration was like watching, as we used to do, Kremlin watching. That's what it felt like looking at the lineup. I think of the next generation, and I would like to feel that hopefulness. Certainly, I'm proud of my kids, but the latest survey of the percentage of young people who would prefer to have a non-elected dictator compared to an elected politician just underlines the lack of trust that has come about over the last generation, maybe just 10 years, but certainly at least that. And I find it very full of despair, you know, and when you talked of Mandela, you're talking about a leader. Tell me where our leaders are. You know, if you're looking at the States or you're looking at this country, where are our leaders to uphold, you know, precisely what you've been, you know, highlighting in your talk? We're, as individuals, you're right, I think probably all of us here are on your side, and we try in our own lives to, you know, bring that forward, and we try to understand from your reporting and others what is the truth, you know, against the barrage of the likes of Truth Social, Mr. Trump's, you know, and the likes of that. And while we can discern it, that doesn't mean that we can help to ensure that it's out there, particularly against the barrage of social media. So it's just a comment, not a question.
Well, okay, I'll ask you a question.
Your hopefulness.
Hang on, I'm going to ask you a question.
I'm sorry.
What would you do?
What would I do? Well, you know, I've lived in Zimbabwe. I've worked all over the world. I'm now doing citizens advice. I do my little bit with the people that I can help in a country that I haven't participated in because I've been elsewhere. That's the only thing that I feel I'm able to hold on to, but I feel that is so partial and it doesn't have the wider significance that it should have. And I'm sure many others in this room feel the same way because, you know, we've had professional lives and we still continue in our ways, but, you know, we want to do more. And I think a lot of it is trying to be behind the leaders, you know, those of us who were in Zimbabwe at independence, to have that feeling that we all had, you know, behind, you know, the guy that became the dictator afterwards, you know, it's something that our kids don't even understand. They simply don't understand. So I'm saying, you know, really, where are our leaders? And if the hope is in the next generation, I guess what our responsibility is to helping them become the leaders, you know, for their generation. That's all that I can say.
Good. There you are. I think that's it. That's a very good answer. I have somebody coming.
Jeff Emerson, a member of the congregation here at one of the masses at Blackfriars. I wonder what your thoughts are on the contribution of people of faith at all different levels, and at the top in our faith is the Pope, who's a significant figure. What's their contribution in your experience of the work you've done across the world and different faiths to the solution and to the problem of peace as you've explored it?
Ooh, I'm glad you asked me that question. I would think it is mixed. I mean, if you look at the period in Africa, 1990 to 94, you had the extraordinary character of Tutu and many other priests who followed his example. And then the behavior of so many of the Catholic priests in Rwanda. Rwanda was a Catholic country, overwhelmingly Catholic, which descended into the worst genocide since the Nazis. So I would say it is mixed, but I am moved by the example of those who risk their lives and who have in Latin America, in Africa, to speak out and denounce. I was hugely moved by the bishop who spoke at the church service for Trump
Yes.
And I think her eloquence and courage says everything. That's what we need. That is what we need. And I would say while we're on the sort of subject of faith, the most important words ever uttered: love one another. Whenever people try and give you weasel words, justifications for violence, for denying people's rights, those words get you through, get me through. Love one another.
Leslie?
Hi there, Virgo. Virgo, I'm Leslie Top. I'm also a member of the congregation at the 9:30 at Blackfriars. I wanted to ask you about migration. It seems to me that that there are a lot of stories of hope that are linked to migration and what migrants and immigrants and refugees have been able to do with their lives and the way they've been able to enrich the places that they go to. And so it continually shocks me, although I'm not a naive person, the hatred that is engendered towards groups of people who move and dare to go and live somewhere where they weren't born. And I wonder if you could give us a kind of any kind of international perspective on that and how it operates in other places. We're very all too familiar with how it operates here in the UK, and of course, seeing what's going on in the States. Thanks.
Well, I'm sad to say it can be much worse in many other places. Thinking of South Africa, the degree of xenophobia and violent xenophobia that has manifested itself on several occasions. Usually, again, at the cynical urging of particular politicians who see an advantage in whipping this stuff up. If you look at, racism towards migrants in parts of the Middle East, in Asia, it's a universal, just as migration itself is this, at the moment, universal phenomenon, so is the kind of dark side of the human response to it. But I think we've got to understand, and I remember being in 2015 on the border of Hungary and Serbia. And it was that week where the huge procession of people was coming up from the Greek island of Lesbos, and they'd come from Turkey, and it was just this endless procession of people. And I was standing behind, watching what was going on. I was standing behind two Hungarian farmers who were looking at this. And I just looked at their faces, and they were absolutely silent and absolutely shocked. And so I think we have to be, it goes back to what I said earlier about talking down to people. If you want to, telling people that they're bigots, telling them that they're racists, that's not going to get us anywhere. It really isn't. Because all we do is, we enjoy the ecstasy of our own righteousness.
Yeah.
But we don't move forward in the vital art of persuasion. And we have to be realistic in terms of saying what it is and at what pace our societies can change. And the truth is, nobody can control it. I mean, the fundamental deceit of politics everywhere is this idea, well, you just stick them all in a boat and send them back. That'll be it. Or build a higher wall. That isn't how human beings work. We know this. And come. And there are people here tonight who work in aid and development. And as I know, that the answer to this issue, if we take it that there's a certain number of people that we can absorb at any given time, it means that there are going to be many, many tens of millions more that we can't. And the answer is something, you know, at the same time as governments across Europe and in the United States, or I mean, the Americans have just cut US aid. How do you think that's going to play in terms of reducing the incentive for people in poverty-stricken countries to try and get to America? It defies belief. And so, you know, unless there is a fundamental change in how the economics of our world are structured, in that economic justice, in the, you know, one of the things I was very struck by talking to migrants, well, over the last 15 years, is people saying when they were trying to get to Britain, you have law there. So it's, you know, economic justice, the rule of law. And unless these things, and I should add a caveat, I am not here doing the neocon, let's export democracy. No way. We went down that road. But unless we're willing to be fair-minded and just in how we deal with the countries these people are fleeing, in terms of trade, in terms of loans, then it's never going to stop. It's never ever going to stop. And I believe migration is a good thing. Of course I do. It enriches our societies. But I also see its capacity in the febrile atmosphere we have now, and in the kind of political debate that exists, for major destabilization and the rise of the far right. We're seeing it. This isn't something we imagine or are warning about. We're seeing it.
Yes, another one from online.
So this is from Hans Georgeson. He says that his soundbite from the time was Mandela's political cry for now is the time. If that was said today, what would you say now is the time for?
Now is the time for hope. Look, I know, I suspect a lot of you are thinking, what a load of old wishy-washy idealistic bullshit. Yeah. Well, let me tell you something, okay? I spend my life basically very often in the sewers of human nature, okay? Seeing the worst that people do to each other. And I've been doing that for decades. And if I can feel hope, then the rest of you who don't do that on a day in, day out basis might give it a try.
Fergal, in a moment you spoke very movingly about civilization and important and essential gestures. In a moment or two, those of us here are going to be engaged in a civilizational drink and a celebration of good company. But is it absolutely essential that we give some gesture of our great thanks to you for having spoken so movingly and so perceivingly and perceptibly this evening? Thank you very, very much indeed for all that you've given us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to relax now with a nice bottle of water.